Hi everyone, I'm Jason Chan, host of today's episode of Expert Connect. I'm here with Reagan. He's the co-founder and VP of Strategy and Client Services at Macarta. Stephen, thanks for joining.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
Hey, thanks for joining again. So I'm excited to have you on. Our goal today is to kind of get our listeners and for those who are watching ready for Prime Day. For some companies, this can be one of the most expensive learning experiences if they don't know how to approach it, right? So that's why we are connecting with you today. Now, without giving away just too much, because we're going to dive a little bit deeper in just a minute, what did you learn last year during Prime Day that you are kind of incorporating into your plan for this year at Macarta?
Jason, I think what I biggest kind of takeaways I think from last year is, not marrying to any one strategy, marrying myself rather to one strategy. Obviously the last 2 years have been a very unique time for all of us to be living and buying and helping people, market and sell effectively online. I always like to look backwards to try to inform the future, of course. But of course, with Amazon, it is a constantly evolving animal, and trying to compare with last year is even a unique challenge in and of itself, because obviously Prime Day fell in June, which just a month out here from this year's Prime Day, but that is a drastically different time to be selling, depending who you are and your brand. And one really unique kind of difference is just that this year Prime Day will be in Q3, so something that's very important for brands and sort of their budget planning. And so all of that being said, I think the biggest takeaway, like I said, is not really getting handcuffed to anything that I think I know for sure, and really just being nimble, agile, and very closely monitoring performance so we can kind of lean into what's working and get ahead of what isn't, basically.
Okay, thank you. So let me frame this for the rest. Basically, let me frame this for the rest of the conversation. For our listeners, we'll be talking about three different areas: lead up to Prime Day itself, and kind of lead out or post Prime Day activities. And by the way, I think that what we're about to dig into today can be kind of applied, I think, to any major shopping event. You might have different lead up or lead out number of days, if you will, right? But let's jump in and start talking about some of the activities you're doing right now, or some of the conversations you're having now with your clients for Prime Day.
So a lot of the conversations that we have with our partners around Prime Day, really they started 6 months ago. Prime Day has become such a mainstream opportunity for brands, and you see it, of course, on Amazon. But even you look at your Best Buys and your Walmarts and any other retailer, really, Amazon has disrupted the way we buy things once again. And you'll see the big deals coming out kind of around Prime Day to really combat and try to compete with Amazon. So point of that is, this has become a much more bona fide component of our planning that we have with our partners, really at the beginning of each year from a budget perspective. And really, it's about how do we maximize this huge opportunity that's becoming, again, more mainstream and just a proper component to people's marketing strategy at the beginning of the year.
So what are kind of some of the tactics leading up to it? What do you recommend that people do right now in terms of maybe taking a look at the data, for example, right? What are the specific metrics you're looking at that you're analyzing from the previous year that you're applying maybe this year?
A lot of the most important numbers or metrics rather that we sort of reference or consider from years past, really around exposure, engagement, and cost per click, basically. Of course, every category, every brand will behave somewhat differently. But we like to kind of roll up information at sort of a segment or a category level to really understand, what's happening sort of beyond just one individual brand, specifically as it pertains to the cost of acquiring customers, or at least clicks, sort of leading up to, during the event, and then obviously in this kind of tail out period. So really it's about efficiency, your return on ad spend or your advertising cost of sale, click-through rate, for some kind of engagement measurement, and then overall impression volume. That's kind of you don't put impressions in the bank, but it's always a really fascinating signal about just the wealth, or rather the size, the volume of people who are coming to Amazon ready to buy, and most of them looking for a deal, expecting a deal.
Do you have a checklist of what needs to be done in terms of the marketing side? For example, there's Amazon storefront, retail readiness. What are you looking to do in the Amazon storefront, for example?
So within the storefront for any of our brand partners, as we really get into Prime Day, it's about what kind of message do we want to communicate? Does the brand want to communicate? And really, where do we want to win? And so that really informs how much we want to really kind of blow up the brand store. And we'll do a lot of things kind of as a temporary store takeover type of a concept where we work with the brand to sort of align on, again, where do they want to win? Are they running any promotions? And then looking to merchandise that experience and create an environment for shoppers to really get the most out of their time, sort of spending or the time they spend within this sort of store environment and experience within the walls of Amazon. Retail readiness is of course hyper important during these events, but it is always a critical component. And thinking about data from last year, we really dig into sort of customer search terms and keyword intelligence. Thankfully, IntentWise helps us really pop the hood and look backwards with a fine level of granularity. And that helps us really understand what was working, from a keyword perspective, and how do we incorporate those messages, those concepts, sort of trends, if you will, within every touch point that a customer might have with our brand partner on, before, during, and after Prime Day.
For Amazon storefront, I've seen a lot of stores kind of mimic their website, reflected on the storefront, and they might have kind of teasers, if you will, kind of banners. They schedule banners to have teasers, and then Prime Day they'll have the exact um, uh, promotion. Are you doing anything like that in that language to kind of tease sellers into kind of, hey, get ready for the Prime Day, or do you actually start promoting and selling before that event?
Well, Amazon obviously has some pretty restrictive, excuse me, they have some pretty lofty restrictions as to in terms of language and how much we can sort of tease that deals are coming and get ready, buckle up type of thing. That being said, we don't lean into a huge sort of pre-event communication in that respect. It's really more about, really increasing our level of sort of aggression, if you will, or just the investment as we lead into these events. I mentioned earlier that Prime Day is so mainstream and everybody knows it's coming. They get excited, and so Amazon has done so much of the heavy lifting to really communicate that. And so in the weeks leading up to Prime Day, it's really about continuing to drive traffic to our brand store environment. And beyond that, it's really building a viable sort of pipeline of shoppers, if you will, when it comes to things like display, remarketing, where we can really use this window of time where there's just a crazy amount of traffic to feed our sort of custom audiences that we're going after if we're looking to sort of remarket to these customers who maybe didn't find the right deal from our brand partner, but we want to continue to stay in front of them, post event.
Okay. How about are you conducting any sort of Amazon experiments before Prime Day?
For experiments on Amazon, absolutely. I mentioned earlier that what I don't want to ever do is really rock the boat, if you will, and make drastic changes. So our planning really again started six months ago. Formally, really probably 3 months ago in a more meaningful way. So that's really your opportunity, I think, to properly A/B test. Prime Day has so many just variables that make a proper test really tough to measure. So we really try to kind of air out those question marks, if you will, as far as our positioning and how do we really want to maximize some of the content components on Amazon, things like A+ experience as well as brand store sort of engagement and efficacy. My point is, from an experimentation standpoint, we really try to do those well in advance of Prime Day so that we have a solid, understanding of what's going to work, driven by data.
Sounds good. Yeah. And, for those who don't know what Amazon experiment is, basically what you can do is test your A+ content, right? Your image and your title. And, the reason why I love Amazon experiments is because versus services out there, that it's a network of paid panelists. it's like asking kind of my family, hey, what do you think of this idea? This, it's great. Okay, give me $100 and I'll give you the product. Then they turn around and kind of walk away, right? With Amazon Experiments, customers are voting with their wallet, basically, right? So you're swapping out different images, different A plus content and title. Um, Advertising, are you doing anything before leading up to Prime Day? Are you increasing budget, decreasing? What are you doing exactly in that regard?
So from an advertising perspective, and I'll kind of focus this in on search advertising through Amazon sponsored ads. We've talking a lot today about sort of this trifecta around Prime Day, really this lead-in period. And regardless of whether Prime Day happened in June last year or October the year before or July the year before that, there has been a very consistent sort of build up, then a pinnacle to this event, and then sort of this tail out period. So really by looking at a handful of metrics, specifically click-through rate, total impression volume, and efficiency from a return on investment standpoint, how did those ebb and flow throughout the sort of life cycle of a Prime Day event? And so I think the fun part for us is really having those conversations with our brand partners and really trying to think outside the box that, typically there tends to be sort of a post-event lull in terms of cost per click, and things start to sort of normalize. And so that presents almost a void in the search landscape that we might be able to really capitalize on, because a lot of these big brands, especially your kind of global or large national brands, it's all about Prime Day. And so this kind of and all the promotions that they've lined up months ago. So once that deal is over, they kind of have to reel things back in, and that has created a bit of a void, I think, in sort of competition. But beyond that, it's really being very, very close and very nimble as far as what's happening. For this year, we'll really start to pull some levers, if you will, and push. I guess rather allow campaigns to spend more money and spend at a higher cost per click about the 1st of July. That's been pretty consistent with what we see in the years past and sort of this 30-day window. One sort of data point that I will share, what we see from a cost per click perspective is the 2 days of Prime Day last year. They were 30% more expensive to acquire or to generate a click. So your cost per click excuse me, I'm gonna run that back again. Your cost per click during the event last year, at least what we saw, was 30% higher than the trailing 2 weeks before that. What is fascinating is that the lead-in period is much longer. And then in that tail out period, things really normalize back to kind of that pre-event average cost per click within about 7 or 8 days, typically. So it's really kind of understanding and more than anything, setting those expectations with ourselves and also with our brand partners that it is going to be more expensive, period. And then you start to think about, what else is a brand maybe doing from a promotion standpoint. And if they're running all these lightning deals or these deals of the day, things like that, that same increase in cost is happening, but yet you might be pulling in 20% less of a retail sale amount. So it really starts to tank some of your efficiency metrics, your ACoS, advertising cost of sale, or your return on investment, ROAS.
Thank you. Let's transition over to Prime Day. Anything else? Did I leave out anything that you would probably might do leading up to Prime Day?
One additional thing that we really really lean into, if you will, from a planning and preparedness standpoint around Prime Day is with our display advertising team. That is obviously a much different animal than paid search, and it's a longer tail sort of strategy in a lot of ways. It's a longer term strategy, I should say. So from kind of an audience planning perspective, that happens even earlier than any of the kind of bigger changes we're making from a search perspective. And it's really about making sure that we can find a relevant and, well, the most relevant audience with a element of recency. So trying to understand, what are my customers really looking at? Where are they browsing? Where are they looking in the last 45 days? And that's going to just help me understand sort of what we might be looking at as we get into the next 30 days into and around Prime Day. So I think audience viability is a huge component of what we do from a display advertising perspective.
I see. So in other words, you might be running sponsored display ads, trying to figure out what your target audiences are, right? Trying to fine tune that, right, for Prime Day.
What I'm Well, I was actually referring to kind of Amazon's DSP advertising, so not strictly within sponsored display. Um, Obviously, sponsored display presents a really unique opportunity, and it's kind of this DSP light, if you will. But Amazon's demand side platform really provides a rich understanding of who your customers are, where are they living, one, but what else are they buying? And that really helps inform kind of brand store strategy as far as adjacent, relevant category targeting, or, really trying to put ourselves in these shoppers' shoes and create this environment within the store, with an A plus, with ad copy and creative that meets them where they are and what they like to do, even above and beyond sort of our brand or the product that we're advertising.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that insight. So let's transition over to Prime Day now. So this is the kind of the main event, day of the event. What are you working on specifically on that day? What should we, as advertisers, be looking at? Brands, what should we be focusing on?
So on the day itself, it's a lot of buckle up and really follow what's happening. Thankfully, Amazon is able to surface a lot of nearly real time information, and we do work obviously very very closely with IntentWise, and set some rules in place prior to the event to really allow these budgets to go well above and beyond what we had been seeing on a trailing 30-day average kind of a thing. But our entire search team is really watching things like a hawk across the board, and really working with their sort of counterparts on our brand management team, who will be looking at some of the operational components, obviously making sure there's no flags or no suppressed ASINs, things like that. And with this crazy influx of traffic, things happen, right? So, the best we possibly can do is try to get ahead of these potential pitfalls, but staying very close throughout the day and sort of the 72 hours kind of before and after the event, to make sure that from kind of that operational perspective as well as advertising, we are able to spend and really to walk through the strategy that we've lined up.
Are you using kind of maybe social media or Amazon posts to draw more attention to the offering?
So when it comes time to things like social media or obviously Amazon posts, their sort of Instagram style feed, that's not so new anymore, but it's definitely becoming more widely adopted. We look at that in a similar perspective as the brand store. It's really building some momentum well in advance of the event. We will work with our partners to find some imagery or some user generated content, anything we can repurpose from other social channels to just get as much content out there as possible. Amazon posts, it has been a component of our strategy by and large for, I guess it launched in maybe end of 19. There's still not a ton of information that we can really action from that other than sort of exposure and how many people saw it, how many people clicked it. I'm sure over time there'll be a lot more behind that, things like revenue and maybe an ability to boost those posts with money. But more than anything, it's about kind of matching the story and the tone of voice that our brand partner is really looking to communicate in general on Amazon, but most specifically, around these events like Prime Day.
How about promotions? There's different types of promotions during Prime Day, right? If you miss the deadline in April, you have other options of maybe discounting, coupons, maybe different types of promotions. What have you seen work percentage wise, dollar amount wise, in your experience?
When it comes to promotions, I'm a bit of a skeptic sometimes, primarily with things like lightning deals. Anymore, there are so many lightning deals and so many deals of the day and things like that, where you're sort of lost amidst the sea of other big promotions. That being said, they work. I think the efficacy is really driven by, or rather predicated by, what else are you doing to get people in front of these promotions, and enter Amazon advertising, right? So I think to really maximize promotions, it's really about, again, giving that exposure in every possible way that exists on Amazon. So of course, search advertising to make sure we're emphasizing these promoted products, creating some experience or destination within the brand store that is nothing but deals. Um, in terms of, sort of my experience around impact, um, with, like anything, the bigger discount and the more recognizable brand or name tends to perform better, just by and large. Um, it is something that, a lot of our partners have a pretty deep relationship with Amazon directly, and so they really line up all of these best deals or deals of the day, things that they're going to be doing as a retail focus, or an internal sales driven tactic. And so that's definitely an interesting observation from my end, is that the promotions tend to be very much focused around a sales opportunity, and less so about, building kind of a momentum from a marketing angle. So a lot of times, people will try to offload inventory, or aging inventory with an event like this. Um, I do think Prime Day is certainly unique from a promotional standpoint, because everybody's expecting a deal, and there's almost an opportunity to not necessarily discount your products, because everything else is on sale, and unless you're wildly outside of kind of the average price point, people kind of assume it's on sale anyways, with or without a badge or a big, call to action about the discount amount, or dollar amount discount.
Hey, thank you for that. How about advertising? When it come to the day of advertising, what are you adjusting? What is your team adjusting? Is it budgets? You're increasing CPC by X amount? And, actually, one other question I have is campaigns. Are you creating new specific campaigns just for Prime Day? Are you seasoning campaigns kind of before and running into Prime Day and then closing it down? Like, what do you do in that area?
One of the things I mentioned earlier is, not looking to make any knee-jerk reactions, and I think part of that really also ties into not creating things 2 days before Prime Day. You obviously at IntentWise are kind of the expert in terms of Amazon's, or rather a new campaign ramp and sort of this relevancy component, and we see it as well. A campaign that has some history and some equity will tend to perform better than something totally new. And so what we really try to do is tweak some evergreen campaigns for a short period of time, kind of throughout the month of Prime Day, whatever month it falls in. And so the point there is to leverage a campaign that has established momentum and equity as it comes to that search term relevancy to the products we are promoting, and then using those existing campaigns to really increase bid levels on keywords that we see to be effective, or that our brand partners are really wanting to win in, if you will. So beyond that, it's definitely allowing our campaigns to spend more with a healthier daily budget, making sure that we're not hitting those caps on the days themselves, and if so, making sure that we can expand them straight away. Um, we really try to inform what we think each campaign will spend by looking at similar segments or strategies from the years past. And all of that is really to try to get kind of a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C together, that we're going to go in looking at a particular daily level of spend. If we see X, then we'll be able to move into that sort of next tier of investment. And it's really to balance the fact that, this is 2 days and we still have, 363 more days to invest. So we can't totally overspend, if you will. So it's about, increasing aggression with some pragmatism to understand that we have, there's more fun to be had later in the year.
How about off Amazon advertising? Do you do anything with working with your clients with their maybe Google ads or the email campaigns?
With regards to outside Amazon advertising, and specifically outside of Amazon's DSP advertising, that's not something that we execute. However, it is certainly more so in the last, I'd say, year and a half, becoming a much more mainstay or front and center component of our broader strategy. I've certainly, I don't have any data to back this up, but it would certainly seem that Amazon really favors traffic that's coming from outside Amazon's walls. And the way I've always sort of rationalized that is that, once, if you're driving traffic from ESPN, let's say, to Amazon.com for your brand, your product that you want to promote, that's obviously fantastic. And we want to sell that brand. And Amazon wants us to make that conversion. But once that customer is on Amazon.com, they're in the everything store. And you better believe that Amazon an Amazon customer coming in from offsite is going to buy the product we're promoting, hopefully, but they might be throwing in toothpaste and toilet paper into their cart. So the point I'm making here is that the level of importance to your non-Amazon marketing and advertising strategy to your Amazon business is just becoming so much more important over time. And I think this favorability, at least my speculation of favorability to traffic coming in from outside, certainly would make sense anyways from a kind of gut check standpoint. So all of that being said, the way we look at and really consult and speak to our brand partners about outside Amazon activity is, as long as it's within sort of brand goals and broader marketing goals, we absolutely want to funnel as much traffic as possible from outside Amazon to this Amazon brand store environment or directly to detail pages.
I like how you mentioned before where hey, sellers can take or brands take this opportunity to get rid of maybe their long-term inventory items that's been sitting there stale, right? And put that in front of the consumer. Do you have any other strategies around Prime Day that people should consider, heading into Prime Day?
So from a promotional strategy, you mentioned that opportunity to move products that aren't selling. One little comment I'll make to that is that a product is slow moving, probably for a pretty good reason. So there's kind of this balancing act of how much do I really want to invest into something that is not a long term, very viable seller, if you will, within my catalog. I think another really strong tactic is really using a promotion to acquire customers and launch a new product. Of course, you run the risk of establishing sort of that price point precedent for a new product, but that's always a surefire way to increase conversion rate is lowering your price. So I think it can be a good strategy when it comes to introducing a new product into your assortment, or maybe in the world of apparel, maybe a new colorway or a new style or fit, something to that effect. So I think launching new products and being, promotions being a part of your sort of go-to-market strategy for Amazon is definitely a viable strategy. And specifically in Prime Day, where there's just so many people on site, just a better chance to get in front of even more people.
Hey, thank you for that. Do you have, let's bring us to a landing, right? Prime Day is over, or special event, the big shopping event is over. The lead out period, what do you do after that craziness just happened, right? What do you do in terms of marketing, advertising in those areas?
So in the post event sort of days, or maybe 10 days, 2 weeks, not a lot of immediate drastic changes, I think, certainly not in the first 48 hours. Really the point there is, I did mention earlier that there can be a void or a vacuum of advertisers, and there absolutely is, but I'm also not the first one to ever say that. So I think people are becoming a lot more attuned to this three-part strategy. So what I'm kind of getting at is that we really let those same, for the most part, sort of same strategies ride for another couple of days. Amazon does have sort of that last bid auction. And so even if we saw a 30% increase to our kind of average cost per click, we're going to keep those bid levels at a spot that will still have the opportunity to capture sales, even if they are a little bit higher than our average cost per click. And then it's really kind of monitoring how that performs and how that behaves in the days following. And then really about 10 days later, we start to kind of shift gears officially and change things, around messaging within the store, as well as kind of our pacing from a spend perspective.
How about in terms of analyzing data? There's a lot of data to go through. What are you looking at in terms of data wise that you can maybe take that as part of the learning to carry over to the next shopping season?
So it's when we're looking at kind of measuring the impact of Prime Day, it is really back to this kind of three-part component to Prime Day. It's really trying to understand what our data and what the performance looked like within these three subsets of Prime Day. Because even if Prime Day is the most kind of pronounced and the biggest, most widely known event, maybe besides Turkey 5, this same kind of lead in and an event and then tail out period definitely happens. It's just a matter of, it might be a little bit more truncated from a time perspective if it's something around Father's Day or Pet Day that they had in May, things like that. So it's really trying to understand, our performance in these three different components of the event, and how do we sort of localize that, if you will, for the next event, whether it's Turkey 5, things like that. So, obviously there is an attribution window at play here. So we're always pulling day after information at a daily level across impressions, clicks, spend, sales, conversions. And then, of course, we revisit that 2 weeks thereafter to really understand what was the true total impact of this event. And I always find that interesting. And that's a common practice, of course, on a monthly basis that we do to true up the numbers. But what we've seen is that there is just a much deeper halo impact from Prime Day. Typically, we'll see maybe 4 or 5% more sales be attributed in those 2 weeks after the spend occurred. But from within Prime Day, it's closer to 7 or 8%, which doesn't sound like a crazy amount, but in the context of sort of a pretty sizable investment, it's a meaningful amount of money that's attributed back to your investment around this event itself.
So before we, Stephen, wrap up, thank you for just all the knowledge you just shared with us and the insights. What are your kind of your closing thoughts, and maybe even one more tip for the audience that we should consider during this event?
Well, Jason, this has been a pleasure. I really appreciate it. As kind of my leave behind, if you will, something I mentioned earlier, and that's really not handcuffing yourself to one strategy. Again, Amazon is a living, breathing organism, and sort of this element of adaptability and fluidity it's not just a best practice; it is absolutely critical and mandatory in general, I would say, but obviously around these big events. So that's kind of the biggest thing, in my opinion, is letting data, really inform your strategy and how you want to kind of maximize the event, and not getting too personally attached to any strategy or any keyword, things like that, and just leaning on the data. I think beyond that, making sure, from again, sort of a data comment, track everything, pull every single data you possibly can, because this is one event, but there are so many more events that you can use this insane influx of traffic to learn from. Not just Turkey 5, but, little micro seasonal events that happen, Halloween, Father's Day, so on and so forth. But the sort of lead in event and tail out period, it does exist really for every kind of event. And then it's about kind of localizing to, what's happening in that event, what time of year, things like that. And beyond that, it's, have some fun, and don't get too in the weeds. I think it's a crazy time. And as long as I think you're tracking things at a very close level, from a data perspective, advertising, make sure you have everything operationally lined up well in advance. From content, ASIN structure, no orphaned ASINs, anything like that. It's about planning ahead and having sort of plan A, B, C, D, E, so on and so forth, really in your back pocket, should something not go the way you sort of anticipated.
Hey, Stephen, thanks for joining me today at Expert Connect. It was great having you today. Thank you again.
Jason, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.